In the shadowed halls of power where crowns are won and lost, where political marriages seal kingdoms' fates, there exists a love story that history will never record. It's the story of a man who chose duty over desire, honor over happiness, and loyalty over love. Captain Marcus Aldrich stands as the ultimate protector, a sword sworn to defend a princess who can never be his, a heart pledged to a woman destined for another's throne. This is not a fairy tale where the humble guard wins the princess. This is the raw, authentic story of sacrifice that cuts deeper than any blade, where the greatest act of love is knowing when to step back, when to remain silent, and when to protect someone's future even if it destroys your own dreams. In a world where power corrupts and ambition destroys, witness what happens when one man's unwavering loyalty becomes both his greatest strength and his most painful burden. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is love someone enough to never tell them how you feel. Are you ready to experience a love story that will break your heart while restoring your faith in true devotion? The morning fog rolled across the training grounds of Valenhall Palace like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of steel against steel. Captain Marcus Aldrich moved through the mist with practiced precision, his sword cutting clean arcs through the air as he trained alone in the early dawn hours. At 28, he had already earned a reputation as one of the kingdom's finest swordsmen, but, more importantly, he had earned something far more precious, the complete trust of the royal family. His blade stopped mid-swing as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard. Even without turning, Marcus knew those steps belonged to Princess Elena Vasquez. 3 years as her personal guard had taught him to recognize every nuance of her movement, every rhythm of her breathing, every subtle change in her voice that others missed completely. "You're up early again." Elena's voice carried a mixture of concern and familiarity that made his chest tighten with emotions he carefully kept buried. She emerged from the fog wearing a simple riding dress, her dark hair braided loosely over one shoulder. At 24, Princess Elena possessed a natural beauty that required no crown or jewels to command attention. But it was her intelligence and compassion that had first captured Marcus's respect, and, eventually, against all reason, his heart. Marcus lowered his sword and turned to face her, maintaining the proper distance that protocol demanded while fighting the instinct to step closer. "Sleep comes easily to those without responsibility, Your Highness. I prefer to be prepared for whatever challenges each day might bring." Elena smiled at his formal response, though her green eyes held a hint of frustration that he recognized well. She had long ago stopped insisting he call her simply Elena when they were alone, but she had never stopped hoping he might soften the walls he maintained between them. The challenges today include a morning ride through the royal forest and an afternoon meeting with the textile merchants, she said, moving to the weapons rack where Marcus had placed his training gear. "Hardly the kind of threats that require you to practice sword techniques before sunrise. Every day brings potential threats when you're sworn to protect the future queen of Valenhall," Marcus replied, beginning the ritual of cleaning and storing his blade. "Your father's kingdom has enemies, both foreign and domestic. Vigilance is not something I can schedule around convenience." Elena picked up one of the practice swords, testing its weight in her hand. Over the years, Marcus had taught her basic defensive techniques, always insisting that knowledge was another form of protection. She moved through a simple sequence of parries and thrusts, her form improving steadily under his patient instruction. "Sometimes I wonder if you ever think about anything besides duty and protection," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral as she continued the practice movements. "Do you have dreams, Marcus? Things you want for yourself beyond serving my family?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Marcus had learned to navigate these moments carefully, to deflect personal inquiries without appearing rude or dismissive. Elena had a way of asking questions that seemed casual, but cut straight to the heart of matters he couldn't afford to examine too closely. "I dream of a kingdom where you never need protection," he answered after a moment, taking the practice sword from her hands as their fingers briefly touched. The contact sent a jolt through him that he immediately suppressed. "I dream of a Valenhall so peaceful and prosperous that guards become ceremonial rather than necessary. That's a dream about my safety, not about your happiness," Elena observed, her perceptive nature once again seeing through his careful words. What about love, Marcus? Marriage? A family of your own? Marcus turned away, ostensibly to organize the weapon rack, but really to hide the expression he couldn't quite control. My life is dedicated to service, Your Highness. Personal attachments would compromise my ability to make clear decisions about your protection. The lie came easily after years of practice, but it tasted bitter on his tongue. The truth was that he had already formed the deepest possible personal attachment, one that made every decision about her protection crystal clear because nothing in the world mattered more than her safety and happiness. The irony that his love for her was the very thing that ensured he could never have her was not lost on him. My father has been discussing potential marriage alliances again, Elena said quietly, and Marcus heard the subtle change in her tone that indicated this conversation was moving towards something more significant. Prince Theodore of Meridian has formally requested permission to court me. Marcus's hand tightened involuntarily on the sword hilt he was holding, but his voice remained perfectly steady when he responded. Prince Theodore is known to be an honorable man from a powerful kingdom. Such an alliance would strengthen Valenhal's position considerably. You sound like my father's advisors, Elena said with a laugh that held no humor. All strategy and political benefit. What do you think of him as a man, not as a political asset? The question was dangerous territory, and Marcus knew it. His personal opinion of Prince Theodore, whom he considered arrogant, entitled, and utterly unworthy of Elena's intelligence and spirit, was irrelevant to his duties. Worse, expressing such opinions would reveal feelings he had sworn to keep hidden. My thoughts on the prince's character are not appropriate for me to share, Marcus said carefully. Your father and his advisors are far better qualified to evaluate potential suitors than a soldier. Elena studied his face with the intense scrutiny that always made him feel exposed, as if she could read thoughts he kept carefully locked away. Sometimes your dedication to protocol is incredibly frustrating, Marcus. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main courtyard. A royal messenger dismounted quickly, his urgent movements suggesting important news. Marcus immediately shifted into protective mode, positioning himself between Elena and the newcomer while assessing potential threats. Your Highness, the messenger called out, bowing quickly. His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. Prince Theodore of Meridian has arrived unexpectedly and seeks an audience. Elena's expression shifted, the playful conversation of moments before replaced by the composed mask she wore for court functions. Thank you, James. Please inform my father that I will attend him shortly. As the messenger departed, Elena turned back to Marcus with a look that seemed to contain both resignation and something that might have been disappointment. It appears the discussion about marriage alliances has moved beyond the theoretical stage. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, but his training kicked in automatically. Shall I escort you to your chambers so you can prepare for the audience, Your Highness? Yes, Elena said, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she continued to study his face as if searching for something. Marcus, if circumstances were different, if I weren't a princess bound by duty and political necessity, do you think it would be possible for someone like me to find genuine happiness? The question struck him like a physical blow, not because of what she asked, but because of what he heard beneath the words. For just a moment, the careful distance he maintained wavered, and he saw his own longing reflected in her eyes. I think, Marcus said slowly, choosing each word with careful precision, that you deserve every happiness the world can offer, regardless of circumstances. And I believe that anyone capable of earning your regard would consider himself the most fortunate man alive. Elena's breath caught slightly at his response, and Marcus realized he had revealed more than he intended. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths that neither could acknowledge directly, even if that man could never claim what he most desired. Elena asked softly. Especially then, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. True devotion doesn't demand possession, Your Highness. Sometimes love means wanting someone's happiness more than your own. For a heartbeat, Elena looked as if she might say something that would change everything between them. Then, the sound of more approaching footsteps broke the spell, and the mask of royal composure slipped back into place. "We should go," Elena said, her voice once again carrying the formal tone appropriate for their respective positions. Prince Theodore should not be kept waiting. Marcus nodded and fell into step beside her as they walked toward the palace, maintaining the proper distance while his mind churned with the implications of their conversation. Prince Theodore's early arrival suggested serious intent, possibly even a formal proposal. The political advantages of such a match were undeniable, and Marcus knew that King Frederick would likely view it favorably. As they entered the palace corridors, Marcus caught sight of their reflection in one of the polished marble pillars. To any observer, they appeared to be exactly what they were supposed to be, a princess and her guard, moving through their assigned roles with appropriate decorum. No one could see the careful space Marcus maintained between them or the way Elena's hands remained clasped tightly in front of her to prevent any accidental contact. "Marcus," Elena said as they approached her chambers, "whatever happens in the coming days, I want you to know that your service to my family has been exemplary. My father could not have chosen a better man to ensure my protection." "Thank you, Your Highness," Marcus replied, though something in her tone suggested this was more than a simple acknowledgement of his duties. Elena paused at her door, turning to face him with an expression that seemed to memorize every detail of his face. "Promise me something. Anything within my power, Your Highness. Promise me that you'll always remember that duty and honor are admirable qualities, but they should never completely eclipse the possibility of personal happiness, even for people like us." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle around his heart like armor, both protecting and constraining him. "I promise to remember your words, Your Highness." Elena nodded and entered her chambers, leaving Marcus alone in the corridor with the echo of her voice and the growing certainty that their conversation had been some form of goodbye. Prince Theodore's arrival would likely accelerate the marriage negotiations, and once Elena was formally engaged, the easy familiarity they had developed over 3 years would have to end completely. He took up his position outside her door, assuming the stance he had maintained thousands of times before. But today, for the first time, the weight of his sword felt heavier than the burden of his unspoken love. As he settled in to wait while Elena prepared to meet her potential future husband, Marcus reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had sworn an oath to protect Princess Elena with his life, and he would honor that oath without question or hesitation. But no one had warned him that the greatest threat to her happiness might come not from enemy swords or political intrigue, but from the very protocols and expectations that his protection was meant to preserve. Today, he would stand guard while she met the man who might become her husband, knowing that his duty required him to ensure nothing interfered with a marriage that would shatter his heart. The palace bells chimed the hour, and Marcus straightened his shoulders as he prepared to escort Elena to what might be the most important meeting of her life. Whatever personal cost his service demanded, he would pay it gladly. After all, that was what love truly meant when you were sworn to protect someone you could never possess. The throne room of Valenhall Palace had been designed to intimidate and impress, with soaring columns that stretched toward painted ceilings depicting the kingdom's greatest victories. Today, as Marcus escorted Princess Elena through the massive oak doors, the grand chamber felt more like a stage set for a performance that would determine the course of her entire life. Prince Theodore of Meridian stood near the throne with King Frederick, and Marcus took his measure immediately with the practiced eye of a man trained to assess potential threats. Theodore was tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his wishes accommodated without question. His clothing was expensive but practical, suggesting a man who valued quality over ostentation. At 32, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had been groomed for leadership since birth. But it was the way Prince Theodore's eyes fixed on Elena that made Marcus's jaw tighten imperceptibly. The look was appraising, calculating, like a merchant evaluating a particularly valuable piece of merchandise. There was interest there, certainly, and appreciation for Elena's beauty, but Marcus saw nothing that suggested the prince recognized the intelligence and strength of character that made Elena truly extraordinary. "Your Majesty," Elena said, curtsying gracefully to her father before turning to acknowledge their guest. "Prince Theodore, welcome to Valenhall." I apologize for keeping you waiting. No apology necessary, Princess, Theodore replied, taking Elena's offered hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was perfectly appropriate, but somehow struck Marcus as presumptuous. The wait provided an opportunity to discuss the mutual benefits our kingdoms might enjoy through closer ties. King Frederick beamed at the exchange, clearly pleased by Theodore's directness and Elena's gracious response. Prince Theodore has brought a most interesting proposal, my dear. Perhaps we might retire to the private dining room, where we can discuss matters more comfortably. Marcus automatically moved to follow, but King Frederick raised a hand to stop him. That won't be necessary, Captain. Prince Theodore's own guards are quite capable of ensuring security for our private discussion. The dismissal hit Marcus like a physical blow, though years of training kept his expression neutral. Being excluded from Elena's protection detail was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. In 3 years, he had never been separated from Elena during any meeting that involved potential threats or significant decisions about her future. Father, Elena said, and Marcus heard the slight tension in her voice that others might miss. Captain Aldrich has been my personal guard for 3 years. His presence at important meetings has always been standard protocol, and his service has been exemplary, King Frederick agreed. But this discussion involves delicate negotiations that require complete privacy. I'm sure Captain Aldrich understands the need for discretion in matters of state. Prince Theodore stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I have no objection to Captain Aldrich's presence if Princess Elena prefers it. In Meridian, we believe that a ruler's personal security should never be compromised for the sake of convenience. The offer was perfectly reasonable and politically astute, but Marcus recognized it for what it truly was, a subtle demonstration of Theodore's willingness to appear magnanimous while establishing his authority over Elena's preferences. The prince was showing that he could afford to be generous because he was confident of his position. That's very thoughtful, Elena replied, though Marcus caught the slight edge in her voice that suggested she had recognized the manipulation as well. However, my father is correct that matters of state require appropriate privacy. Captain Aldrich, please ensure that our guest's security detail is accommodated properly. Marcus bowed formally, acknowledging the dismissal while feeling as if something vital was being torn away from him. Of course, Your Highness. I will be available should you require anything. As the royal party moved toward the private dining room, Elena glanced back once, and in that brief look Marcus saw something that might have been apology mixed with determination. Then, the doors closed, leaving him alone with Prince Theodore's guards and the growing certainty that everything was about to change. The Meridian guards were professional and courteous, asking practical questions about palace security protocols and guard rotation schedules. Their captain, Sir Garrett, was a man of perhaps 40 with the weathered look of a soldier who had seen real combat rather than just ceremonial duty. Your princess seems quite intelligent, Sir Garrett observed as they walked through the palace corridors. Prince Theodore values that quality in women. His sister, Princess Catherine, serves as one of his primary advisors on domestic policy matters. Princess Elena is indeed remarkable, Marcus replied carefully, unsure whether the comment was intended as genuine conversation or subtle intelligence gathering. Her dedication to the welfare of Valenhal's people is well known throughout the kingdom. And your dedication to her protection is equally well known, Sir Garrett said with a slight smile. Prince Theodore made specific inquiries about you before arriving. Your reputation as a swordsman and as a man of honor preceded you. The comment sent a chill through Marcus, though he maintained his composed expression. I serve at the pleasure of His Majesty and am honored by any recognition of that service. Of course, Sir Garrett agreed. Though I wonder if you've considered what might happen to your position should Princess Elena marry and move to Meridian. I imagine such a transition might create certain opportunities for career advancement. The implication was clear, though diplomatically phrased. Prince Theodore was already planning for Elena's departure from Valenhal and considering how to handle the practical details, including the disposition of her current personal guard. The fact that inquiries had been made about Marcus's reputation suggested that his position was being evaluated along with every other aspect of Elena's current life. I serve where I am most needed, Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral despite the turmoil in his chest. Should circumstances change, I trust that His Majesty will determine the best use of my abilities." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace page who requested Marcus's presence in the courtyard. One of the junior guards had been injured during training, and his expertise was needed to determine whether the wound required the attention of the palace physician. The injury proved to be minor, a deep cut on the forearm that would heal cleanly with proper care. But attending to it provided a welcome distraction from the knowledge that Elena was currently discussing the terms of her potential engagement to a man who saw her as a political asset rather than a remarkable woman deserving of genuine love and respect. As Marcus cleaned and bandaged the wound, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Elena that morning. Her questions about dreams and personal happiness had not been idle curiosity, he realized now. She had been testing the waters, perhaps hoping for some indication that alternatives to political marriage might exist. The irony was devastating. Marcus would have gladly spent his life ensuring Elena's happiness, but the very circumstances that had brought them together made any future between them impossible. A princess of Valenhall could not marry a guard captain, no matter how devoted or honorable he might be. Such a match would be seen as a scandal that would undermine the monarchy's authority and potentially destabilize the kingdom. "Captain," the injured guard said, breaking into Marcus's grim thoughts, "I wanted to thank you for the training you've provided over the past months. Your instruction has made all the difference in my development as a soldier." "You've earned every advancement through your own dedication," Marcus replied, finishing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Continue to train with discipline and honor, and you'll serve the kingdom well regardless of what changes the future might bring." The young guard's face showed confusion at Marcus's somewhat cryptic response, but before he could ask for clarification, another page arrived with a summons. King Frederick requested Marcus's immediate presence in his private study. Marcus's stomach tightened as he made his way through the familiar corridors. Summons to the king's private study were rare and usually indicated either significant commendation or serious concern about his performance. Given the timing, immediately following his exclusion from Elena's meeting with Prince Theodore, Marcus suspected this conversation would fall into neither category. King Frederick was standing behind his desk when Marcus entered, silhouetted against the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. At 55, the king maintained the erect bearing of his military background, but Marcus noticed new lines around his eyes that spoke of the weight of recent decisions. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, bowing formally and waiting for permission to speak. "Marcus," King Frederick said, turning from the window with an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been regret. "Please sit. What I have to discuss is better addressed as a conversation between men rather than a formal audience." Marcus remained standing, knowing from experience that maintaining protocol often made difficult conversations easier for everyone involved. "I prefer to stand, Your Majesty, if that meets with your approval." King Frederick nodded and moved to stand directly in front of Marcus, his gaze steady and measuring. "Prince Theodore has formally requested permission to court Elena with the intention of marriage. The political advantages of such an alliance are substantial, and I have given him preliminary approval to proceed." "Congratulations, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, though the words felt like broken glass in his throat. "Princess Elena will make a remarkable queen for any kingdom fortunate enough to claim her." "She will indeed," King Frederick agreed. "Which brings me to the reason for this meeting. Prince Theodore has made it clear that should the engagement proceed, he would prefer Elena to come to Meridian with minimal entourage. A fresh start, as he puts it, allowing her to integrate more completely into Meridian's court culture." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, though he managed to keep his expression neutral. "I understand, Your Majesty. Such arrangements are common in diplomatic marriages. Theodore has specifically mentioned that Elena's current personal guard would not be required in Meridian." King Frederick continued, his voice carefully neutral. "He believes that providing her with Meridian guards would demonstrate his commitment to her integration and eliminate any potential conflicts of loyalty." The words hit Marcus like a sword thrust to the chest, but he had been expecting them since Sir Garrett's careful probing earlier. Of course Prince Theodore would want Elena's personal guard replaced. Any perceptive man would recognize that Marcus's devotion to Elena went beyond professional duty, and a husband would naturally want to eliminate such complications. "I serve at your pleasure, your majesty," Marcus said, proud that his voice remained steady. "Should you determine that my services are better utilized elsewhere, I will accept that assignment with honor." King Frederick studied Marcus's face intently, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that the king was seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Marcus, in the 3 years you have served as Elena's personal guard, your dedication has been beyond reproach. You have protected not just her physical safety but her reputation, her dignity, and her peace of mind. I could not have asked for better service." "Thank you, your majesty. Which is why what I'm about to ask will be one of the most difficult requests I've ever made of any man in my service," King Frederick continued. "I need you to help Elena understand that this marriage is not just politically necessary, but personally beneficial for her future happiness." Marcus felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. King Frederick was asking him to convince Elena to marry Prince Theodore, to use the trust and respect she had for him to encourage her acceptance of a marriage that would take her away from everything familiar and place her under the authority of a man who saw her primarily as a political asset. "Your Majesty, I'm not certain I'm the appropriate person to offer Princess Elena counsel on such personal matters," Marcus said carefully. "On the contrary, you are exactly the right person," King Frederick replied. "Elena respects your judgment more than anyone else's, with the possible exception of my own. She trusts you completely, and she values your opinion on matters that affect her safety and well-being. If you were to express support for this marriage, she would give that support significant weight in her decision." The request was devastating in its implications. King Frederick was asking Marcus to betray the very feelings he had spent 3 years carefully concealing, to use Elena's trust in him to encourage her acceptance of a marriage that would destroy any possibility of their own happiness. It was, Marcus realized, the ultimate test of his loyalty, not just to the crown, but to Elena herself. "Sir," Marcus said slowly, "may I speak freely?" "Of course. Do you believe Prince Theodore will make Princess Elena genuinely happy?" King Frederick was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window where the palace gardens stretched toward the horizon. "I believe Theodore will provide Elena with security, status, and the opportunity to serve as queen of a powerful kingdom. I believe he will respect her intelligence and value her contributions to his rule. Whether that constitutes happiness is a question I cannot answer definitively. But you believe it's the best option available to her," Marcus stated rather than asked. "I believe it's the most practical option available to her," King Frederick corrected. "Elena is a princess of Valenhall, Marcus. Her personal happiness, while important to me as her father, cannot be the primary consideration in a decision that affects the security and prosperity of our entire kingdom. She understands this, just as you understand the duties that come with your position as her guard." Marcus absorbed the king's words, recognizing the parallel being drawn between Elena's duty to marry for political advantage and his own duty to support decisions that serve the kingdom's interests regardless of his personal feelings. "What specifically would you like me to tell Princess Elena?" Marcus asked. "Tell her that you believe Prince Theodore is an honorable man who will value her contributions and treat her with the respect she deserves," King Frederick replied. "Tell her that marriage to him represents an opportunity for her to have the kind of influence and purpose she has always sought. And tell her that you believe she has the strength and wisdom to find contentment in any situation where she can serve a greater good." Every word of what King Frederick asked was technically true, but Marcus knew that speaking them would feel like the deepest betrayal of his feelings for Elena. Yet refusing the request would be a dereliction of his duty that could potentially harm both Elena and the kingdom. "I understand, your majesty," Marcus said finally. "When would you like me to speak with Princess Elena?" "Tomorrow morning," King Frederick replied. "Prince Theodore has suggested a formal announcement of the engagement within the week, assuming Elena accepts his proposal. When Elena departs for Meridian, you will be offered a position of significant responsibility within Valenhall's military structure. Your talents deserve recognition beyond personal guard duty." The offer of advancement felt hollow in the face of losing Elena, but Marcus recognized it as King Frederick's attempt to soften the blow of reassignment. "Thank you for your confidence in my abilities, Your Majesty." As Marcus left the king's study, he felt as though he was walking toward his own execution. Tomorrow, he would have to look Elena in the eyes and encourage her to marry Prince Theodore, knowing that his words would help seal her fate and his own. It was, he realized, the cruelest possible demonstration of how love and duty could become indistinguishable when serving someone whose happiness mattered more than your own survival. The morning arrived gray and cold, with winter clouds hanging low over the palace grounds like a physical manifestation of Marcus's mood. He had spent the night lying awake, rehearsing the words King Frederick had asked him to speak, while fighting the overwhelming urge to do exactly the opposite, to tell Elena to refuse Prince Theodore's proposal and find some way, any way, to choose her own path. But duty had been drilled into Marcus's bones since childhood, and loyalty to the crown had been the guiding principle of his adult life. More than that, loyalty to Elena herself demanded that he consider her long-term welfare rather than his own immediate desires. As much as it would destroy him to encourage her marriage to Prince Theodore, Marcus knew that his personal feelings could not be allowed to compromise what might genuinely be her best opportunity for a secure and meaningful future. He found Elena in the palace library, seated near the tall windows with a leather-bound volume of political philosophy open in her lap. She wasn't reading, Marcus noticed immediately. Instead, she was staring out at the gardens with the distant expression that meant her mind was working through complex problems. "Good morning, Your Highness," Marcus said, maintaining his usual formal tone despite the intimacy of finding her alone in the quiet space surrounded by thousands of books. Elena looked up with a smile that seemed forced, though she made an effort to appear genuinely pleased to see him. "Good morning, Marcus. I was hoping you might find me here. I wanted to apologize for yesterday's dismissal from the meeting. The decision wasn't mine to make." "No apology is necessary," Marcus replied, moving to stand at the respectful distance protocol required. "Your father was correct that matters of state sometimes require absolute privacy." "Were they matters of state?" Elena asked, closing the book and setting it aside. "Or were they matters of my personal future being discussed as if I were a piece of property to be negotiated over?" The bitterness in her voice caught Marcus off guard. In 3 years, he had rarely heard Elena speak with such open frustration about the constraints of her position. She had always seemed to accept the limitations of royal life with grace and resignation, focusing on the opportunities for service rather than the restrictions on personal choice. "Princess," Marcus said carefully, "your father loves you deeply. Any decisions he makes about your future are motivated by his desire to see you safe and fulfilled." "Fulfilled," Elena repeated with a laugh that held no humor. "Do you know what Prince Theodore told me yesterday, Marcus? He explained that he sees great potential in me as a queen who could serve as an effective partner in ruling Meridian. He appreciated my intelligence and education, and he believed we could have a productive working relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals." Marcus felt his chest tighten at Elena's words, recognizing the careful diplomatic language that revealed everything about how Prince Theodore viewed their potential marriage. "Those are admirable foundations for a royal union," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "A working relationship," Elena said, standing and moving to the window. "Mutual respect and shared goals." He spoke about our potential marriage as if he were negotiating a trade agreement. Not once did he mention affection, companionship, or any of the things that make two people want to share their lives together. Marcus moved closer, still maintaining propriety but unable to bear the sadness in her voice without offering some comfort. "Prince Theodore may not be given to romantic expressions, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't value you as a wife beyond your political usefulness." Elena turned to face him, and Marcus saw something desperate in her eyes that made his heart ache. "Marcus, I need you to be honest with me. Not as my guard or as my father's subject, but as someone who knows me better than anyone else in this palace. Do you think I could be happy in a marriage based on political convenience and mutual respect?" The question was exactly what Marcus had been dreading since his conversation with King Frederick. Elena was asking for his honest assessment, but she was also, whether she realized it or not, asking him to choose between his duty to the crown and his loyalty to her personal happiness. "I think," Marcus said slowly, choosing each word with excruciating care, "that you have the strength and wisdom to find meaning and purpose in whatever situation life presents to you. You've always been remarkable in your ability to focus on service rather than personal gratification." "That's not what I asked," Elena said, moving closer until she was standing just outside the formal distance Marcus maintained. "I asked whether you think I could be happy, not whether I could be useful or dutiful or successful, but whether I could wake up each morning for the next 40 years content with the choice I'm about to make." Marcus felt as though he were being torn in half. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to tell Elena to refuse Prince Theodore's proposal, to insist that she deserved more than a marriage based on political calculation. But King Frederick's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that Elena's personal happiness had to be weighed against the welfare of an entire kingdom. "Your Highness," Marcus said, falling back on formality as a shield against the intensity of the moment, "happiness is often found in accepting responsibility for something larger than ourselves. You would be serving not just Meridian, but strengthening the alliance between our kingdoms and ensuring greater prosperity for both peoples." Elena's expression shifted, and Marcus saw hurt flash across her features before being replaced by something that looked like resignation. "I see. So you agree with my father that duty should take precedence over personal feelings." "I believe," Marcus said, the words coming out more harshly than he intended, "that people in positions of responsibility don't have the luxury of making decisions based solely on personal preference. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is accepting circumstances we cannot change and making the best of them." As soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus realized how they sounded, like a man who had given up on the possibility of personal happiness and was encouraging her to do the same. The irony was devastating because it was exactly what he was doing, but not for the reasons Elena would assume. "I understand," Elena said quietly, turning back toward the window. "Thank you for your honesty, Marcus. It's helpful to know where you stand on the matter." Marcus could hear the walls going up in her voice, the careful distance that indicated she was retreating from intimacy to protect herself from further disappointment. He had accomplished exactly what King Frederick asked. He had given Elena his support for the marriage to Prince Theodore. But in doing so, he had also convinced her that the one person in the palace who truly knew her believed she should settle for a marriage without love. "Elena," he said, her name slipping out before he could stop himself. She turned back, startled by his use of her name without the formal title. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the small space that separated them, and Marcus saw years of carefully controlled feelings reflected in her eyes. "I want you to know," Marcus continued, abandoning protocol entirely, "that any man who has the privilege of calling you his wife, for whatever reason that marriage comes about, will be the most fortunate person alive. You deserve every happiness the world can offer, regardless of the circumstances that shape your choices." Elena's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly, maintaining the composure that had been trained into her since childhood. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." Before Marcus could respond, footsteps in the corridor announced someone's approach. Elena immediately moved back to her chair and picked up the book, while Marcus resumed his formal position near the door. When Prince Theodore entered the library with one of his guards, they appeared to be exactly what protocol demanded: a princess reading peacefully under the watchful protection of her assigned guard. "Princess Elena," Theodore said with a smile that was warm but calculated, "I was hoping to find you here. Your father mentioned that you often spend your mornings in the library." "It's one of my favorite places in the palace," Elena replied, standing to greet him with perfect courtesy. "The collection of diplomatic histories is particularly comprehensive." "Excellent," Theodore said, clearly pleased by her intellectual interests. "I brought a small gift that I thought you might appreciate." He gestured to his guard, who stepped forward carrying a leather satchel. "These are copies of the trade agreements my father has established with the Eastern Kingdoms. I thought you might find the economic strategies interesting, particularly since you'll be involved in similar negotiations once we're married." Marcus watched Elena's face carefully as she accepted the gift, noting the slight stiffening around her eyes at Theodore's casual assumption that their marriage was a foregone conclusion. Her response was gracious and appropriate. "Thank you, Prince Theodore. I'm sure I'll find them very educational. I'm also hoping you might join me for a tour of the palace grounds this afternoon," Theodore continued. "I'd like to better understand the defensive structures here so I can incorporate the best features into Meridian's fortifications." "Of course," Elena agreed. "I'll have Captain Aldrich arrange an appropriate escort." Theodore's gaze shifted to Marcus for the first time since entering the library, and Marcus found himself under intense scrutiny from a man who was clearly evaluating him as a potential complication. "Actually," Theodore said after a moment, "I was hoping we might walk alone, or perhaps with just one guard from my personal detail. It would allow for more frank discussion of sensitive security matters." The request was reasonable on the surface, but Marcus immediately recognized it for what it really was: another step in Theodore's systematic replacement of Elena's current support structure with people loyal to him. First, he had arranged for Marcus to be excluded from important meetings. Now he was beginning to establish precedents for Elena to rely on Meridian guards rather than her current protection detail. "Captain Aldrich has been responsible for my security for 3 years, Elena said, and Marcus heard the subtle emphasis that indicated she understood exactly what was happening. "I have complete confidence in his discretion regarding sensitive matters." Theodore's smile became slightly strained, but his voice remained pleasant. "Of course, I meant no reflection on Captain Aldrich's competence. I simply thought it might be beneficial for my own guards to begin familiarizing themselves with Valenhal's security protocols." "That makes perfect sense," Elena replied. "Perhaps Captain Aldrich could coordinate with your head of security to arrange comprehensive briefings for your entire detail." Marcus recognized Elena's response as a diplomatic way of maintaining her current security arrangements while appearing to accommodate Theodore's concerns. But he also saw the calculation in Theodore's eyes, and knew that this was just the opening move in a campaign to systematically isolate Elena from her current support system. "An excellent suggestion," Theodore agreed. "Captain Aldrich, perhaps you could speak with Sir Garrett about establishing a joint security protocol for the remainder of my visit." "Of course, Your Highness," Marcus replied formally. "I'll arrange a meeting immediately." As Marcus moved to leave, Elena caught his eye and held his gaze for just a moment longer than protocol would normally allow. In that brief contact, he saw gratitude, uncertainty, and something that might have been a request for him to remain vigilant about her welfare even as circumstances began to change around her. "I'll be in the courtyard should you require anything, Your Highness," Marcus said, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning would suggest. Elena nodded slightly, acknowledging both his formal statement and the deeper promise it contained. "Thank you, Captain." As Marcus left the library, he could hear Theodore beginning to explain the economic implications of the trade agreements he had brought as a gift. The prince's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone discussing a subject that genuinely interested him. But Marcus noted that his explanations focused entirely on policy outcomes and strategic advantages. There was no warmth in his tone, no attempt to connect with Elena on a personal level beyond their shared intellectual interests. Walking through the palace corridors, Marcus reflected on the impossible position he found himself in. He had successfully completed the task King Frederick had assigned. He had given Elena his support for the marriage to Prince Theodore. But in doing so, he had also taken the first step toward losing her forever, not just physically but emotionally as well. The afternoon tour of the palace grounds proceeded exactly as Marcus had expected. Prince Theodore asked intelligent questions about defensive capabilities and expressed appropriate admiration for Valenhal's architectural features, but his interest was purely professional. He evaluated everything in terms of its strategic value and potential application to his own kingdom's needs. Elena responded with the detailed knowledge and thoughtful analysis that made her such a valuable advisor to her father, but Marcus could see the careful distance she maintained even as she played the role of gracious hostess. She was performing the part of an interested potential bride while keeping her true thoughts and feelings carefully hidden. As they walked through the gardens where Marcus had often watched Elena find peace and solitude, he noticed that she avoided looking at the places that held special meaning for her. The bench where she often sat to read, the fountain where she sometimes came to think through difficult problems, the secluded path where she had once told Marcus about her dreams of traveling to distant kingdoms. All of it was presented to Prince Theodore as charming features of the palace grounds rather than places where Elena's heart had found refuge. The defensive walls are impressive, Theodore commented as they concluded the tour near the main gatehouse. And the integration with the natural landscape shows excellent strategic planning. My engineers will want to study the construction techniques. I'm glad you find them interesting, Elena replied. My great-grandfather supervised the design personally, incorporating lessons learned from conflicts with the northern kingdoms. Practical experience applied to long-term planning, Theodore said approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes for effective rule. You clearly understand the importance of learning from history to shape future policy. Marcus listened to their exchange with growing unease. Every conversation between Elena and Theodore centered on policy, strategy, or administrative efficiency. They discussed Elena's potential role as Theodore's queen in terms of her usefulness as an advisor and partner in governance. Never once did Theodore express curiosity about Elena's personal interests, her fears, her hopes for the future, or any of the things that made her remarkable as an individual rather than valuable as a political asset. As they returned to the palace, Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. Tomorrow, before Elena made her final decision about Prince Theodore's proposal, he would find a way to have one last honest conversation with her. Not the carefully diplomatic discussion King Frederick had requested, but a real conversation about what she truly wanted for her future. He owed her that much, even if it cost him everything else. The ancient bell tower of Valenhall Palace chimed midnight as Marcus made his way through the darkened corridors toward Elena's chambers. Protocol dictated that her night guards would be stationed outside her doors, but Marcus knew their routines well enough to approach without detection. What he was about to do violated every rule of proper conduct between a guard and a princess, but the formal announcement of Elena's engagement was scheduled for tomorrow evening, and this might be his last opportunity to speak with her honestly. Earlier that day, Marcus had watched Elena accept Prince Theodore's formal proposal with grace and apparent contentment. The ceremony had been small but significant, attended by both royal families and witnessed by key advisors from both kingdoms. Elena had played her part perfectly, expressing gratitude for Theodore's offer and pledging to honor the alliance through their marriage. But Marcus had seen the careful control in her eyes, the way she held herself with rigid composure that suggested she was performing a role rather than celebrating a joyful decision. Now, as Marcus approached Elena's private sitting room through the servants' passages he had memorized during 3 years of ensuring her security, he wrestled with the knowledge that what he was about to do could destroy his career and potentially create a scandal that would harm both Elena and the kingdom. But the alternative, allowing her to proceed with a marriage that would make her profoundly unhappy without giving her one chance to hear the complete truth, felt like a betrayal of everything he truly owed her. The sitting room was softly lit by a single candle, and Elena was seated near the window in her nightgown with a heavy robe wrapped around her shoulders. She wasn't sleeping, Marcus realized. She was sitting in the darkness, staring out at the palace grounds with the same distant expression he had seen in the library 2 days earlier. I was wondering if you would come, Elena said without turning around, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment before resuming a rapid, irregular rhythm. You were expecting me, Your Highness? I was hoping you might find a way to say goodbye properly, Elena replied, finally, turning to face him. In the candlelight, Marcus could see that she had been crying, though her voice remained steady and controlled. Our conversation in the library felt incomplete somehow. Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him while his mind reeled from Elena's admission that she had been waiting for him. Elena, I need to tell you something important. Something I should have said days ago instead of hiding behind duty and protocol. Elena stood slowly, moving toward him with careful steps that suggested she understood the significance of this moment as clearly as he did. Before you say anything you might regret, Marcus, I need you to know that I've accepted Prince Theodore's proposal. The formal announcement will be made tomorrow, and the wedding is planned for spring. Nothing you say tonight can change those facts. I understand the political realities, Marcus said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. But you deserve to make this decision with complete information, and I failed to give you that. What information could you possibly have that would matter now? Elena asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer to her question. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that the words he was about to speak would change everything between them regardless of how Elena responded. You asked me once whether I ever thought about anything besides duty and protection. You asked about my dreams, my desires for personal happiness. I lied to you, Elena. I lied because the truth would have made it impossible for me to continue serving as your guard. Elena's composure wavered for the first time, and Marcus saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them together to still them. Marcus, don't. I love you, Marcus said, the words finally breaking free after 3 years of careful containment. I have loved you since the first month I served as your guard, when you insisted on personally thanking every palace servant who worked extra hours during your father's illness. I love your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, and the way you see possibility for good in every situation you encounter. I love the sound of your laugh, and the way you think through problems by walking in the garden. I love your dedication to serving others, and your refusal to use your position for personal advantage. Elena's breath caught, and tears began streaming down her face. But she didn't speak or move to stop Marcus from continuing. I know that loving you is hopeless, Marcus went on, the words pouring out with 3 years of suppressed intensity. I know that my position makes it impossible for me to offer you anything that could compete with what Prince Theodore can provide. I know that my feelings for you are inappropriate and potentially dangerous to your reputation and your future. But you asked me to be honest, and the honest truth is that every decision I've made as your guard has been influenced by the fact that your happiness matters more to me than my own life. Why are you telling me this now? Elena whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Why tonight, when it's too late to matter? Because tomorrow you'll become officially engaged to a man who sees you as a valuable asset rather than a remarkable woman, Marcus said, stepping closer until they were separated by less than an arm's length. Because you deserve to know that you are loved completely and without reservation, even if that love can never be acknowledged or acted upon. Because I couldn't bear the thought of you spending the rest of your life believing that you're only valued for your political usefulness. Elena covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. You don't understand what you're doing to me, Marcus. I've spent weeks trying to convince myself that I could be content with Theodore, that mutual respect and shared purpose could be enough for a fulfilling marriage. And now you're telling me, I'm telling you that you are worthy of passionate, devoted, unconditional love, Marcus said, reaching out to gently take her hands and pull them away from her face. I'm telling you that any man who has the privilege of calling you his wife should consider himself blessed beyond measure. And I'm telling you that even though I can never be that man, knowing you and serving you has been the greatest honor of my life. Elena looked up at him with eyes that held years of carefully suppressed longing mixed with fresh anguish. Do you have any idea how unfair this is? For 3 years, I've watched you maintain perfect professional distance while I fell in love with your honor, your dedication, and the way you see protecting me as the most important work in the world. I've spent countless nights wondering if the careful way you avoid personal conversations means you find me uninteresting, or if there might be something more behind your reserve. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. Elena loved him, despite all the barriers between them. Despite the impossibility of their situation, she had developed the same hopeless attachment that had been tearing him apart for 3 years. Elena, he said, her name coming out like a prayer. And now, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears continued to fall. You're telling me that we've both been suffering in silence while I prepare to marry a man who will never understand what makes me who I am. Do you realize how cruel that knowledge is? Marcus felt as though he were drowning in the intensity of the moment. Everything he had hoped and feared was confirmed. Elena returned his feelings, but that only made their situation more tragic rather than offering any hope for resolution. I'm sorry, he said, though the words felt inadequate. I should have kept silent. I should have let you marry Theodore without burdening you with information that only makes everything more painful. No, Elena said firmly, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. I'm glad you told me. I'm glad to know that I wasn't imagining the connection I felt between us. I'm glad to know that love like this is possible, even if we can't have it. Marcus leaned into her touch, allowing himself just this moment of honest intimacy before reality reasserted itself. What happens now? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting against his cheek as she seemed to consider their options. Now I marry Theodore and move to Meridian, and you continue your service here in Valenhall. We honor our duties and accept that some dreams are too costly to pursue. Elena, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Elena interrupted, but her voice was gentle rather than harsh. You know I do, Marcus. Even setting aside the political implications, what alternative do we really have? I'm the Princess of Valenhall. You're a guard captain. There is no scenario in which we could be together without destroying both our lives and potentially destabilizing the kingdom. Marcus knew she was right, but the finality in her voice made his chest ache as though something vital was being torn away. I wish circumstances were different. So do I, Elena whispered. But wishing doesn't change reality. They stood together in the candlelit silence, both understanding that this moment represented the closest they would ever come to the life they both wanted but could never have. Tomorrow, Elena would begin her new life as Prince Theodore's betrothed, and Marcus would begin the process of learning to serve a kingdom that no longer included the woman who had given his life meaning. Will you do something for me? Elena asked finally. Anything. Will you promise me that you'll find happiness somehow? Maybe not the happiness you wanted, but some form of contentment that makes your life worthwhile. I can't bear the thought of you spending the rest of your life alone because of feelings you can't act on. Marcus almost smiled at the irony of Elena worrying about his future happiness while preparing to enter a loveless marriage for the sake of political duty. I'll try, if you'll promise me something in return. What? Promise me that you'll look for ways to find joy and fulfillment in your marriage to Theodore. He may not love you the way you deserve, but you're strong enough and remarkable enough to build something meaningful from whatever foundation you're given. Don't resign yourself to mere endurance. Elena nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I promise to try. And promise me one more thing, Marcus said, memorizing every detail of her face in the soft candlelight. Promise me that you'll never doubt your own worth. You are extraordinary, Elena. Your intelligence, your compassion, your strength. These things have value that goes far beyond political convenience. Don't let anyone, including Theodore, convince you that your worth lies solely in your usefulness. I promise, Elena whispered. Marcus leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, allowing himself just this one moment of closeness before they had to return to the roles that would define the rest of their lives. I love you, he said one final time. I will always love you, regardless of where life takes us from here. And I love you, Elena replied, her voice barely audible. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for loving me completely, even when it was hopeless. They separated slowly, both understanding that this goodbye had to last them for the rest of their lives. Marcus moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle to look back at Elena one last time. Goodbye, Elena. Goodbye, Marcus. As Marcus slipped back through the servants' passages toward his own quarters, he felt both devastated and strangely at peace. The conversation had been painful beyond description, but it had also been honest in a way that honored the depth of feeling they had both carried in silence for so long. Tomorrow, Elena would announce her engagement to Prince Theodore, and Marcus would begin the process of transitioning her security arrangements to Meridian guards. Within months, she would be married and living in another kingdom, building a new life based on duty and political necessity rather than love and personal choice. But tonight, for just a few precious minutes, they had acknowledged the truth of what existed between them. They had loved each other completely, and honestly, even if that love could never be expressed beyond words spoken in a candlelit room that no one else would ever enter. It wasn't the life Marcus had dreamed of, but it was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all they could ever have. 5 years had passed since Princess Elena's wedding to Prince Theodore, now King Theodore following his father's death 2 years earlier. Queen Elena of Meridian had become exactly what everyone had predicted, an intelligent and capable ruler who brought wisdom and diplomatic skill to her husband's court. The alliance between Valenhall and Meridian had proven enormously beneficial to both kingdoms, strengthening trade relationships and providing mutual security against threats from neighboring territories. Captain Marcus Aldrich, now Colonel Marcus Aldrich and commander of Valenhall's Royal Guard, stood in the palace courtyard reviewing preparations for a state visit that would arrive within hours. After 5 years of dedicated service in his expanded role, Marcus had earned recognition as one of the kingdom's most respected military leaders. His promotion to colonel had come with responsibilities that kept him busy enough to hold the worst of his memories at bay, though certain quiet moments still brought an ache that time had dulled, but never completely eliminated. The visiting delegation would include King Theodore and Queen Elena, making their first official return to Valenhall since their wedding. The purpose of the visit was to negotiate a new trade agreement and discuss coordinated military responses to recent threats from the Eastern Kingdoms. For Marcus, it would be the first time seeing Elena since her wedding day, when he had stood in formal dress uniform among the other palace guards and watched her pledge her life to another man. "Colonel," Lieutenant James Morrison called out as he approached across the courtyard. "The advance guard from Meridian has been sighted approaching the main gates. They should arrive within the hour." Marcus nodded, running through the final security protocols one more time in his mind. "Have the guest quarters been thoroughly inspected? And what about the dining hall arrangements for tonight's formal banquet?" "Everything has been reviewed according to your specifications," Morrison replied. "Sir Garrett sends his regards, by the way. He's looking forward to seeing you again." Sir Garrett, now captain of Queen Elena's personal guard, had written occasionally over the years, sharing professional updates and ensuring coordination between the security details when official communications needed to be exchanged between the kingdoms. His letters had been carefully neutral, focusing on operational matters rather than personal information, but Marcus had read between the lines enough to understand that Elena had adapted to her new life with the grace and strength he had always known she possessed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Marcus's attention to the main palace entrance. A column of Meridian guards rode through the gates in perfect formation, their blue and silver uniforms marking them as elite royal protection. Behind them came the royal carriage, an impressive vehicle that spoke of Meridian's prosperity and King Theodore's taste for displaying his kingdom's wealth. Marcus positioned himself with the other senior officers to greet the visiting monarchs, maintaining the formal stance that protocol required while fighting to keep his expression neutral. 5 years had given him plenty of time to prepare for this moment, but seeing Elena step down from the royal carriage still hit him like a physical blow. Queen Elena of Meridian had grown into her role completely. She moved with the confident bearing of a woman accustomed to command, and her clothing reflected both her status and her practical nature. Rich fabrics cut in styles that were elegant but not ostentatious. At 29, she possessed a mature beauty that was even more striking than the youthful Princess Marcus remembered. But, more importantly, she carried herself with an air of quiet authority that suggested she had found ways to make her position meaningful. King Theodore helped Elena from the carriage with courteous attention, and Marcus noted that their interaction seemed comfortable and mutually respectful. Theodore had aged well, his bearing showing the confidence of a man who had grown into his responsibilities as king. When he smiled at something Elena said, Marcus caught a glimpse of genuine affection that suggested their marriage had developed beyond mere political convenience. King Frederick stepped forward to greet his daughter and son-in-law, and Marcus watched Elena's face light up with unmistakable joy as she embraced her father. Whatever compromises she had made in her personal life, Elena's love for her family and her homeland remained strong. "Your Majesties," King Frederick said formally, "welcome back to Valenhall. We are honored by your visit, and look forward to productive discussions about our continued alliance." "Thank you, Father," Elena replied, and Marcus noticed that she still called King Frederick by the familiar title despite the formal setting. "It's wonderful to be home, even if only briefly." As the royal party moved toward the palace entrance, Elena's gaze swept across the assembled officers, and, for just a moment, her eyes met Marcus's. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in that brief exchange Marcus saw recognition, surprise, and something that might have been a mixture of pleasure and pain. Elena's step faltered almost imperceptibly before she regained her composure and continued walking beside Theodore. But Marcus had seen enough to know that encountering him after 5 years had affected her as strongly as seeing her had affected him. The formal reception proceeded exactly as planned, with King Frederick presenting his key advisors and military leaders to the visiting monarchs. When Marcus's turn came, he stepped forward and bowed with perfect military precision. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I am Colonel Marcus Aldrich, commander of the Royal Guard." King Theodore extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Colonel Aldrich, your reputation has reached even meridian. Sir Garrett speaks very highly of your professionalism and expertise." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, accepting the handshake while maintaining careful control over his expression. "Marcus," Elena said, and hearing her speak his name again after 5 years nearly undid his composure entirely. "Congratulations on your promotion. Father has written about your excellent service in his letters." "Your Majesty is very kind," Marcus said, allowing himself to meet her eyes directly for just a moment. "I trust your journey was pleasant and that your stay in Valenhall will be comfortable." "I'm certain it will be," Elena replied, her voice carrying a subtle warmth that only someone who knew her well would recognize. "Valenhall has always felt like home to me." The formal introductions continued, and Marcus stepped back into line with the other officers, but he remained acutely aware of Elena's presence throughout the remainder of the ceremony. When the royal party finally moved inside the palace, Marcus found himself standing alone in the courtyard, trying to process the reality of Elena's return. She looked well, he concluded. More than well. She looked like a woman who had found ways to build a meaningful life within the constraints of her circumstances. The quiet strength he had always admired in her had matured into genuine authority, and her interaction with Theodore suggested a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose, if not passionate love. The knowledge should have brought Marcus comfort, but instead it left him feeling strangely hollow. For 5 years, he had carried the image of Elena as someone sacrificing her happiness for duty, a tragic figure trapped in a loveless marriage for the sake of political necessity. Seeing her as a confident, capable queen who seemed to have found contentment in her role forced Marcus to confront the possibility that he had been holding onto an idealized memory rather than accepting the reality of Elena's life. That evening's formal banquet proceeded with all the elaborate ceremony that diplomatic occasions demanded. Marcus, as commander of the Royal Guard, was seated with the senior officers at a table positioned to observe the entire hall while remaining appropriately separate from the royal table where Elena and Theodore dined with King Frederick and his closest advisors. Marcus found himself watching Elena throughout the meal, noting how she engaged with the various courtiers and diplomats who approached the royal table. She listened attentively to every conversation, asked intelligent questions that demonstrated her knowledge of the issues being discussed, and offered thoughtful comments that clearly influenced the discussions. King Theodore frequently deferred to her opinion on matters of trade and diplomatic protocol, suggesting that he genuinely valued her contributions to their joint rule. When Elena laughed at something one of the Valenhall advisors said, Marcus felt the familiar ache that he had thought he had learned to manage. Her laughter was exactly as he remembered, genuine, musical, and completely unguarded. For a moment, she looked like the princess he had known rather than the queen she had become, and Marcus was transported back to mornings in the palace garden when she would share some amusing observation about court life. "She seems happy," Lieutenant Morrison observed quietly, following Marcus's gaze toward the royal table. Marcus realized he had been staring more obviously than was appropriate, and forced himself to look away. Queen Elena has always possessed remarkable resilience and adaptability. Sir Garrett mentioned that you knew her well during your time as her personal guard. Morrison continued, apparently unaware of the sensitive territory he was entering. He said she specifically asked about your welfare when they began planning this visit. The information hit Marcus like an unexpected blow. Elena had asked about him. After 5 years of marriage to another man, building a new life in a distant kingdom, she had remembered him enough to inquire about his circumstances. I served Princess Elena for 3 years, Marcus said carefully. It's natural that she would take some interest in the welfare of her father's officers. Morrison nodded, accepting the explanation at face value. But Marcus could see that his deflection hadn't been entirely convincing. The younger officer was perceptive enough to recognize that there was more to the story, even if he couldn't guess what that might be. The banquet continued with toasts and formal speeches about the alliance between Valenhall and Meridian. King Theodore spoke eloquently about the mutual benefits both kingdoms had gained through their partnership, praising King Frederick's wisdom and Queen Elena's contributions to strengthening diplomatic ties. When Elena arose to offer her own toast, Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited to hear her voice again. To Valenhall, Elena said, raising her goblet toward her father and the assembled court, the kingdom that taught me the values that guide my service as queen. And to the understanding that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from building alliances based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the welfare of our people. The toast was perfectly diplomatic, but Marcus heard something more personal in Elena's words, a recognition that her marriage to Theodore, whatever its emotional limitations, had indeed provided her with opportunities to serve in meaningful ways. She had found purpose in her role as queen, even if that purpose had come at the cost of personal happiness. After the formal ceremonies concluded, the royal party retired to the private reception room where more intimate discussions about trade agreements and military cooperation would take place. Marcus was not included in these meetings, but his duties required him to coordinate security with Sir Garrett for the remainder of the visit. They met in Marcus's office, a spartanly furnished room that reflected his focus on functionality over comfort. Sir Garrett had aged well in the 5 years since Elena's wedding, though Marcus noticed new lines around his eyes that suggested the increased responsibilities of protecting a queen in a foreign kingdom. "It's good to see you again, Marcus," Garrett said, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "Your promotion to colonel was well-deserved. King Frederick made an excellent choice in expanding your responsibilities." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "And congratulations on your appointment as captain of Queen Elena's Guard. I imagine the transition from Valenhall to Meridian presented some unique challenges." Garrett smiled wryly. Adjusting to a new kingdom's protocols while protecting a queen who was also adjusting to completely new circumstances required some creative problem-solving. But Queen Elena made the transition as smooth as possible. She has a remarkable ability to adapt to new situations while maintaining her essential character. Marcus